Welcome, everyone. We are here today with Krista Tippett and Eboo Patel, two wonderful members of the Progress Network. We are a new organization bringing prominent, constructive public voices together to see what kind of better future we can write together. Just a few quick tech things before we go into the introductions and then the conversation that we're going to have. Probably by now we're all used to these Zoom meetings, but just in case you're a new Zoom person, you can toggle between gallery and speaker view on your upper right-hand corner. And down below, you're going to see a button called Q&A. So we're going to be talking for about 40 minutes. And after that, we're going to be taking questions. So any questions you would like answered, you can enter through that Q&A box. And you can put them in at any time, but they'll be answered at the end. All right, so I'm Emma. I'm the Executive Director of the Progress Network, and I'm here with our founder, Zachary Karabell. And as I mentioned, two of our wonderful members. We have Eboo Patel. He's the founder of the Interfaith Youth Core, which is putting forth this vision of a truly pluralistic nation for the U.S., working on college campuses to bring students together of different faiths. And Eboo has written a few books. I think the most recent one was Out of Many Faiths. Is that right, Eboo? Mm-hmm. And we're here with Krista. She is the host of the On Being podcast. I think many of you are familiar with her podcast. It's a wonderful listen if you're not familiar with it already. And Krista has written a few books as well. What was the most recent one, Krista?
Becoming Wise.
And you have a new one coming out?
I do, but it's taking a little time. There's been a lot going on.
Yeah, very understandable.
Hopefully next year sometime.
Understandable. All right, so I'm going to turn things over to Zachary, who's going to give a little bit more of an introduction to us, the Progress Network, and what we're going to be talking about tonight.
Great, and thanks Emma and Eboo and Krista and everybody who's out there now joining us. Again, this is our inaugural Progress Network event, which we launched about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And just in the wonderful world of technology, it happens to be that our website is down right now. Coincidental to our first event, just as a cosmic, just when you think things are in the right groove. But the whole point of the Progress Network as a conception, which actually happened, I thought about this before the pandemic. I thought about not launching it because of the pandemic, and then felt very strongly that it was absolutely essential to launch it during the pandemic, was that we have a contemporary culture that is relentlessly focused on the negative. And certainly in the West and certainly in the United States, we also have, over the past years and accelerating certainly this year, a strong tendency and media-fueled culture that is looking at all the downsides. And clearly in this year, it feels much more tractionable to look at the downsides because it's been such a complicated, painful, unexpected challenge that we've all faced collectively and we are all facing individually in our pandemic age, in our political age that is so intensely partisan, that has kind of been woven into the pandemic in a especially toxic way. And then you add to that a media culture that has always been about hot emotions, anger, outrage, fear. The news du jour has always been fueled by hot news, hot emotions. Back to the old Tolstoy line that there is no novels about a happy family, but that every unhappy family is unhappy in its own particular fashion. So, we gravitate towards narratives of despair and dysfunction and dystopia. And I wanted to bring together, I think initially it's about 80 people, of whom Eboo and Krista are two, and then have that grow over an extended period of time, because there's a community of voices out there, many of whom are quite prominent in their own way, who are pointing toward a more constructive future, not from a starry-eyed Panglossian optimism of everything is great and we should just be telling more stories of cats and dogs and living together, but from a perspective of clarity that the human condition has always been one of struggle, and that there is often a great deal of ability for all of us collectively to meet that and solve for it. And that if you're going to look at history as kind of a neck and neck race between the human capacity, incredible capacity to destroy, and the incredible human capacity to create, the fact that we're here having that discussion would suggest that at least narrowly the human ability to create and move forward has at least edged out the destructive ability, and that we need to pay more attention to our constructive capacities in the world today. So with that, we also thought, one thing that's really missing from the public sphere in the contemporary world, but which was much more woven into all spheres for much of human history, was religion and faith and spirituality. And certainly one of the things that's been most striking to me, and I think, I'll speak for Krista and Eboo as well in this, is the absence of what has been usually so prominent in a time of great struggle and facing disease, which is religion and spirituality, and some greater public sphere for how do we confront these challenges, and what does it mean, and what does it mean in terms of our relationship to life and mortality and the collective. And the absence of that from a news perspective, from a collective discussion perspective, from a political perspective, has certainly not helped us gain some perspective. So we're going to have a conversation for about 35 minutes. Please use the Q&A function as we go along, the lower tab on your screen on the right. I'll look at the Q&A. We'll bring up those questions, maybe weave them in as we go along, and maybe focus them a little more at the end. So one thing to start with is, given where we are in our political process, and I'll ask Eboo this first. What is it about a long experience that you've had of looking at how intensely, and often faiths that have been often intensely in conflict, particularly Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, but as you and I both know, and I've written about, there's also been an incredible legacy of coexistence and comedy. What is the lessons of that incredible history of both conflict and cooperation, and the work that you've done in that, in a political climate today that seems almost as extreme in its divisions into partisan camps as these faith-based groups were into their absolutism about, we are on the side of right and truth, and our adversaries or others are on the side of the demons, and we have to essentially fight to the death to one side becomes victorious and the other is vanquished, right? So what is that history of religious conflict and then also cooperation? What does it offer us in a world where we're so locked into the other as being the adversary and the demon when it comes to our political culture?
So thank you for inviting Krista and me to be a part of this, Zach, the part of the opening event. Thank you, Emma, also, and then part of the network in general. So, I love this idea, right? I love this idea of a progress network, not because I think that progress is inevitable, but I also don't think it's impossible. And I think that we all can play a role. And I actually think what we emphasize in the stories we choose to tell is a significant part of that. And so I love your book on this, Peace Be Upon You. In fact, I think it's maybe like the best and most readable book on the history of interfaith cooperation. And what you say up front in that book is basically, if you want to find instances where people of different faiths have fought, it's never ending. But if you want to find instances of cooperation, that rabbit hole goes deep also, from the civil rights movement to Hind Swaraj in South Asia, to the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, to honestly every hospital within 25 miles of where every single person, with the possible exception of Emma, who is in Greece, is sitting right now. Every hospital that you can imagine is a shining citadel of interfaith cooperation. It probably started by the Methodists or by Catholics or by Lutherans or by Jews. It's why it's called St. Luke's Hospital, or in Louisville, Jewish Hospital, right? Or Rush Presbyterian. And there are Muslim physicians working with Hindu physicians, working with Jewish respiratory therapists. The CEO is a secular humanist who was raised as a Buddhist, et cetera, et cetera. all of them are brought to their task in some way or another because they're inspired by their tradition to be a healer, and they are almost always, at least attempt to be deeply respectful of the different faith of their patient. So what the rituals around birth are for the patient's family, that's attended to. What the rituals around death are, that's attended to. Again, this stunning example of interfaith cooperation that we just take for granted. And what I would love to do when it comes to progress in general and religion in particular is kind of play what I call the red wheelbarrow game, right? Is to play the game of reflecting on how much we depend upon these things that we just take for granted. So if I could offer a mental exercise, just imagine you woke up tomorrow and every institution founded by a faith community had disappeared. And I don't just mean the houses of worship, right? Which is terrible, and not just because people can't go to prayer, but also because that's where the AA meeting is held. That's where the food distribution takes place. I'm also thinking about the K-12 schools, the social service centers, the universities founded by faith communities. So a part of what I want to shine the light on is the role that religious traditions play in our civil society, and especially cooperation between those traditions. I'm going to plug in here and see if the audio is any better.
Krista, do you want to jump in while we...
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that deep view of the religious picture that Eboo has. I think, I guess where I have put my attention, or something that I've thought about so much, kind of coming back to some of your introductory remarks. What I think we're missing is that, so in our culture at large, but also in terms of the religious voice in our culture, something that happened in the last few decades is that we have reduced the public to the political, at least kind of in our imaginations. And religious voices have squeezed themselves into political boxes and used political vocabulary and forms. And a lot of time that has really meant a reduction and in fact a betrayal of the spirit of what those traditions arose to do. A simplification for sure. And what I'm missing is public theology, what that used to mean. And I feel like that's what we might aspire to figure out, what that looks like and what it sounds like and who those voices would be for this century. It's not going to be Reinhold Niebuhr, from the mid 20th century. It's not going to be these mostly white Protestant theologians who would be on the cover of Time magazine and would have a voice that could, in a much more homogeneous culture, that could be so broadly heard. But I do believe that our need that I think of religion, of religious traditions, but also of theology as a really beautiful and essential part of the human enterprise. These are carriers of conversation across generations about what matters in a life and what matters in a death, and how to live together and how to love, and how hard that is and how complex we are. They're carriers of thinking about moral imagination. They're carriers of ritual. And, I have found myself in this year, 2020, reaching for words that only theology provides, that just feel essential for our life together, like lamentation. That we need these to be parts of our public life. We need these practices, and politics doesn't carry them. It doesn't hold them. I also, I'm reaching for language of confession and repentance and redemption. Change even healing, which we're now reaching for. There's now this public call, but these are traditions that have cultivated deep, deep thinking and practice about how that happens. So that's how kind of, that's what I see when I look at what I would like to see more of in terms of the religious presence.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up Niebuhr, who was such a huge part of culture and life in the 1940s and 1950s. I think he was on the cover of Time magazine and Newsweek 5 or 6 times over a 15 or 20-year period. And then, of course, the whole 1960s and part of the civil rights movement, whether it's William Sloane Coffin at Riverside Church or whether it's Martin Luther King, all of whom come out of a ministerial tradition, right? And you're right, we don't have the space for that now. But I wonder if it's because we're just not making the space. I mean, in a really new age way, if any of you ever saw the movie Contact, which was not one of the world's greater films, but it has a role for Matthew McConaughey as, we're confronting an alien race, and he's brought into the White House, again, as this like voice of, in his case, kind of new age spirituality as a necessary component of confronting the unknown and our fears around that. I mean, are we just too far gone and too atomized and too splintered? Or do you think that, is it like, do we all have to be that voice rather than expecting that voice from oracular authority to come down and dictate to us?
We have to reinvent it, just like we have to reinvent a lot of things we need, right? We have to reinvent education and public health and, in many ways, the political system. So civil society, I mean, that's partly why we're here. Little things. Yeah. And so it's going to be everything that Eboo is working in. It is going to be such a spectrum of humanity and tradition and teaching. And I think it's not just going to be people who are ordained, and there will be a secular aspect to it. But if you think about Niebuhr, what also is so important in that model is that he wasn't on one side of the political spectrum or another, right? This was a voice for moral imagination, for ethical challenge, that challenged every side of the political spectrum, every simplification and caricature, to do better, to go deeper, to honor the depth of our humanity.
So, Eboo, on that.
I think it's Krista, you serve as that voice in a lot of ways, right? And there's probably and you serve as that voice in a way that bridges divides. In a more partisan way, Obama served as that voice for Blue America, like deeply theologically knowledgeable. You don't get the sense that when he goes to Mother Emanuel Church, he'd spend 2 weeks practicing Amazing Grace. You get the sense that was a muscle that he had in his gut, and it just came out, right? And so I think what's interesting is maybe to ask the question, where does it exist and how do we identify it, right? And if you think about Trump minus red state evangelicals doesn't exist. Like there is, and so it is interesting that the things that you can't do without religion in public. I think that Obama's theological articulacy and the way that Black Protestantism, liberal Black Protestantism had gotten into him was a huge part of the way he spoke to the nation, and kind of the nation understood him, right? And Krista, I would say kind of the same for you in a more poetic vein. I mean, Marilyn Robinson has been all over the news recently, but here's a novelist who she doesn't drip with public charisma, and yet over the last 25 or 30 years, she's told the American story in a way that an awful lot of people say is one defining strain, probably overly emphasizing on Black Protestantism, but William Barber would be another defining strain.
Yes. And there are also, I mean, there's somebody like Russell Moore in the Southern Baptist Convention who really is like the chief ethicist, who is an incredibly complex and challenging and deep thinker. I think, there are these people all over the place. and in all kinds of communities. It's just that in our time, they are way below the radar, where in the mid 20th century, you could have someone like Niebuhr, like Heschel, like King, who was above the radar. But the radar is broken and has to be reinvented as well.
It's funny, on both Niebuhr, on Marilynne Robinson, and part of the whole Gilead was a profound awareness of our own individual, if not failings or shortcomings, or just our own individual darkness, and being able to grapple with that. And I wonder, Eboo in particular, there's the kind of fantasy land of coexistence and dealing with people who you are deeply at odds with. But then there's also the nitty gritty of it, right? Which is kind of staring something in the eye that you find morally abhorrent, and then having to look into yourself and kind of recognize that, the kind of who am I to judge sort of thing. Do you experience that ever in the work you do? I mean, there's a tendency to kind of do the kumbaya. I'm not saying you do. I'm saying there's a tendency of like, we should just look for commonalities. But part of the power of Marilynne Robinson, of the Gilead trilogy, and some of the work that you referenced, Krista, is much more of a a willingness to like look at the same thing in yourself and not just externalize it onto somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll take that first as you pitch it to me for a sec. I think you're talking about two different things. Okay, one is an awful lot of what IFYC focuses on is the pragmatics of interfaith cooperation, and a hospital is the single best example, right? Really important things happen in hospitals, really, really important things, and they happen to the human eye practically, but they happen also cosmically. There's births and deaths all the time. There's sicknesses and prayers all the time. There's all kinds of remarkable forms of cooperation. And part of what's happening is that people who would vote very differently, right now in Chicago, there are people who voted differently who are saving lives together in hospitals. And we just expect that to happen. I actually find that stunningly inspiring. So my sister-in-law is a respiratory therapist, a Muslim woman outside of Houston, and she complains about all these Trump supporters who have Fox News on and Trump signs in their hospital rooms. And then when they need an intubation, you know what she does? Puts on her PPE and goes and intubates them. And I actually find that remarkably inspiring. And her Islam is a part of that, right? Like it is a part of the reason that she became a healer. And a big part of what IFYC does is to say, let's pay attention to the areas where inspiring practical interfaith cooperation happen. And by practical, I don't mean to de-emphasize. Again, I mean to kind of do a red wheelbarrow type thing. So much depends upon this. We shouldn't take it for granted. We should actually strengthen this muscle. And then we ask the question, if we can cooperate together on a heart surgery across doctrinal lines or across ideological lines, where else can we cooperate together? Right? What else can we do together? And can you actually create those spaces? Can we be proactive about creating those spaces? So that's a lot of what IFYC does. There's a second thing that you talked about, and we kind of go, through a whole training thing for particularly college students and young adults. How do you create spaces where it is easier for people from different backgrounds to cooperate with each other? And I think one of the great gifts of interfaith of doing interfaith work right is you take disagreement as a given. And I actually think that is part of the problem in the political discourse right now is you expect to agree on things that are important. What if you didn't? What if you came to the table expecting disagreement? It's like a mountain climber not being surprised that the mountain is there. She expected to climb it, right? So if you expect disagreement, now, by the way, I think that there are like lines of decency. So I'm not buying a brownie from the KKK bake sale, but I'm not expecting my interlocutor to agree with me on A to Z on the political issues in American life. I'm expecting to be a firefighter together. I'm expecting to play basketball together. I'm expecting to perform heart surgery together. If we can kind of have that framework, the question becomes, can we create more spaces in which disagreement is expected and cooperation is framed as an opportunity?
Eboo, I also think that what has happened in interfaith relationship and organizations and leadership inside communities all over the place since 9/11 is actually a model. And it's a part of our story, kind of back to the fact that we only talk about what is broken, and we point at that, because there is a level of, I would say, interfaith friendship, and not, much more than collaboration, shared life, shared work, shared mission in all kinds of communities that really came about. There was an investment in that after 9/11. So at the same time that it is true, and this we hear about, Islamophobia has been on the rise, anti-Semitism has been on the rise. It's not like these things have gone away, but there is also this coming together that I've seen in my travels over the last few years in community after community. I remember there was one month, like last year, where I went someplace in Ohio, I went someplace in Iowa. In each of these places, I was part of a convening that included caregivers, service organizations from the community, and a rabbi, a minister, and the head of the Muslim community. In each case, the head of the Muslim community was a woman, and the rabbi and the head of the Muslim community in each of these places were like leaning into each other, completing each other's sentences. And all of them, the Jew and the Muslim and the Protestant, worked at the local Catholic college, right? And the thing is, and what I'm not saying is that they agree on everything or that they're more like each other than they were before, but what they have created is this deep friendship so that they can be both different and kin.
So I love that. And I'm going to follow up on that before we let you get another question. And Zach, or maybe you want to follow up on this also, given that this is one of the 500,000 topics you've written an entire book on. You write 5 articles a week plus 2 books a year. I don't know how you do it. But so Joe Biden is part of a marginalized minority. Okay. He's a straight white male. He's the second Catholic to be elected president. And you know what? Nobody, zero, nada is talking about it.
Yeah.
Right. But not that long ago, like literally in people's memory, any Catholic near high office, Supreme Court justice, cabinet appointee, senior member of Congress, was a Trojan horse for popery. John F. Kennedy almost lost an election because of that. Al Smith did lose a presidential election because of that. Arthur Schlesinger famously said, the deepest bias in the American people is anti-Catholicism. Now, I don't think that that's technically true. I think that there's probably a deeper bias against African Americans, perhaps against women, gay folks. But the point is that a historian of Schlesinger's caliber put Catholics in that circle. And the fact that there has been no conversation about that at a time, by the way, when 6 members of the Supreme Court are Catholic and the Speaker of the House of Representatives is Catholic. Look, at one point in the Obama years, 2011 or 2012, you had a Black president and the entire presidential line of succession was Catholic. Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, John Kerry, right? So what's the point that I'm making, right? The point that I'm making is this is a massive example of progress. America metabolizing its anti-Catholicism, which nobody has commented on. Why not? Why isn't this considered a dramatic American triumph? America was launched, as everybody knows, as a racist project, but also as an anti-Catholic project, right? John Winthrop sails the Atlantic saying he's going to build a bulwark against the Pope. He's going to prevent the designs of Jesuits. Why don't we, in my mind, as good of an example of the need for the Progress Network, Zach, is nobody talks about the metabolization of anti-Catholicism in America as an example of American progress, as an achievement. And actually one whose handmaiden is evangelical Protestants, who, by the way, were the principal advancers of anti-Catholicism. And now people like Newt Gingrich are converting from evangelical Protestantism to Catholicism. a wonderful story of progress.
It's a lovely point. I think part of it is there's been this like movable feast of religious intolerance in the United States. So, we go from one thing to another, more focused culturally, maybe in a productive way, on what we're failing to do, right? So it's Islamophobia now, or it's racism now, rather than what we've done. Although this could be a whole other series of discussions. We kind of oscillate between self-congratulations and self-flagellation, depending on which moment and which side of the fence you're on. So, I mean, it's vital to recognize that change. I also think people have somewhat too high expectations for what coexistence and acceptance of the other is. We tend to have a much more, I think, idealistic notion of what it is to have some degree of common ground with others whose views you may find deeply objectionable. And it's rarely a mature meeting of, I see you, I see your faith, I see your views as being antithetical to mine, but I respect them, embrace them, and I want to have conversation. It usually starts with, I can't silence you and I can't kill you. And that's an awfully low, not particularly idealistic bar, but in US history, it started more from I can't actually eliminate those with whom I disagree vehemently. And so I've got to deal with them. And obviously our political culture today is veering more toward this fantasy of, the other, like blue America is going to drop off the face of the earth, or red America is going to drop off the face of the earth, rather than we're sort of stuck with each other, right? And what do we do about that?
I think that's a cynical take from the head of the Progress Network.
It's not cynical. I think you have to start with a more realistic dealing with others rather than expect that it's all going to come with a full package of embrace. That's all I'm saying. Like it's a baby steps. It's incremental. It's not, I have to just come and embrace the other. And I think once you start that.
Could it be that it wasn't that long ago that a guy whose neighbors, who half of his neighbors wouldn't recognize him on the street, Barack Obama, goes from a dude who lost a congressional race by 30 points and whose wife was furious that he maxed out their credit cards, and it was like, just take the job that Chicago is offering you, to president of the United States. And his big story was that the decency of American civic life could be lifted up into our political life. That if you have a Hindu friend and a Muslim doctor, maybe that doesn't have to stay and that is kind of common in American civic life, which it still is, I think, right? In our PTAs, in bowling leagues, certainly in our hospitals. Could that be lifted into American political life? I don't think he achieves that, but he wins 2 elections. And I think the dark side that we have entered into is that the polarization and partisanship of our political life has been hypercharged by the current occupant of the White House, whose time is waning, and injected into our civic life. But I guess I wonder, from a Progress Network vantage point, is it, if we had an Obama 10 years ago, and I don't mean him as a partisan character. I mean him as kind of an exponent of a particular idea of America, right? If it wasn't that long ago that we had an Obama, could it be that far away in the future?
I mean, that's the amazing ability of things to change dramatically and on a dime in ways that you cannot imagine when you're totally immersed in the moment. I want to pivot for a moment to Krista's lamentation, which I think is such a, simultaneously beautiful and aching word that you're quite right is increasingly invisible from a secular space. And in a lot of ways, I've thought about this during pandemic land, where we are, all of us globally, immersed in a secular public health script, right? And I really am not saying that with any value judgment one way or the other. I'm just saying that happens to be the script that is guiding most of our lives. And it's a particular script also in Western medicine that many of the incredible innovations and progress of Western medicine has been predicated on making death a pathology, or making death something that happens only at the very end, at the very latest. And we've all benefited massively from that, and what's happening now with vaccine development is the nth part of that. But as you say, in a time of pain and death, spirituality, religion, whether it's traditional religions, whether it's more atypical or non-traditional, have been a cup that holds that pain and that challenge and that fear, and it's kind of gone, right? So what are you finding in that? I mean, you have more these conversations more than most, and it's amazing to me how little that's been part of our collective discussion at a time when, the fear of death, the reality of death, the ever-presence of death at the door has never been more acute collectively for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And yet somehow we seem to be talking about it even less than under normal times.
Yeah, and to me, I mean, there are many things going on, but one of them is this fact that we collapsed public life to political life. And so we don't have this public sphere where we could grieve, for example. In other cultures across time, there were public rituals, there were social rituals for soldiers coming home from war, for mourning. This is so our public life is so devoid of emotional intelligence and of spiritual intelligence. And here's another reason I think public theology deserves a place, because our traditions tell us more of the truth of the reality of what it means to be human. And by implication, what it means to be a society made up of human beings. Our kind of national political narrative is things will go up, 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 and up, right? We will defy the laws of physics, or we'll fix it. We'll fix everything. Our traditions tell us things will go wrong. We will die. Our traditions have always told us the ground beneath your feet is never as solid as you think it is. And this year, in 2020, we all kind of rediscovered that at the same time. It was shocking because we have so trained ourselves not to be living completely in reality. And therefore, if that's our public narrative, we're not going to create a space for mourning, for grieving, for acknowledging loss. But the ravages of this go so deep because we also don't have a public culture where pain and fear have their place, right? I always say that anger is what fear looks like when it puts on its armor and shows itself in public, because we're only interested in strength in public, and this is not a partisan thing. And so even pain and fear have to look like a muscle. And I mean, this has become so dangerous for us, not as a part of our life together, as we do in our families, to be honest about our vulnerability and our frailty and mark those things and share those things when they're happening. And yeah, I mean, I think about the costs to us coming out of this year of all of this loss that we haven't grieved. It's been hard enough to grieve it on a personal level because of lockdown. But we haven't acknowledged it. And we're going to, we would know this if it were a family, if somebody died or 10 people you knew died, and other people who you love, people who they love, you would take that in, you would dwell with it. And if you didn't, if you just moved on, it would still catch up with you at some point. We would know this in our personal lives, and we need to know it in our public life.
I mean, Eboo, you're still doing work with hospitals, right? Which are kind of the epicenter of where that comes in. And the only visibility most of us have into hospitals in the world today are, news clips of people, of doctors, of ER nurses, of ICU nurses, often talking in terms of the politicization of all this, right? They're rarely given an opportunity or asked to speak in the language that Krista has just articulated. They're asked to speak in terms of whose fault is it, and what is failing about us that's causing this. But that's a very small snippet of what even those people are experiencing daily. Do you see more of kind of what Krista's talking about kind of on the ground there, where people are? You're muted, Eva.
There's a super inspiring alum named Caitlin Butler, that IFYC alum, that the New Yorker actually did a piece on. She's a chaplain in a New York City hospital. And because part of the devastation of COVID is that, at least in the beginning of the pandemic, March, April-ish, visitors were not allowed at hospitals. There's less news about that now, but you couldn't have visitors there. And so people who were deeply ill or passing away, they couldn't have family there. They oftentimes couldn't have a member of they couldn't have a clergy person from their tradition there. And so you had doctors, nurses, chaplains basically having to provide last rites for people from a range of different religions. And this New Yorker piece on Caitlin followed her around and paid attention to the Muslim prayer beads that she had in her pocket that she would give to Muslim patients, the Buddhist chant that she knew that she would chant outside the door of the window of a Buddhist patient who was passing from one world to the next. And I just found it was so moving and so beautiful. And Caitlin's become a friend, and I asked her about Franklin Graham's Samaritan's Purse, the hospital in Central Park that Franklin Graham, very conservative, kind of opposed to lots of people type Christian, that he had set up there. And I said, would you work there? And she paused for a second, and she's like, I'm not sure I would work there, but if Franklin Graham were sick in this hospital, I would serve his spiritual needs the way that he saw those spiritual needs needing to be served. And I just found that like such an example of servant leadership, and such an example of the kind of skill set and knowledge base, but also sensitivity of heart that's needed at a time like this. And I want that story to be lifted up, right? I mean, I think that Caitlin is exceptional at what she does, but I think the vast majority of nurses and doctors are leaning in and doing what they can and trying to figure out what is it that gives this person spiritual comfort at this time. And one of the things I tell students a lot, I spend a lot of time on college campuses. Now I spend a lot of time zooming into college campuses. They want to talk about their identities a lot. And one of the things I remind them of is diversity work is more about the other person's identity. And if you're a doctor and you're dealing with a patient near the end of life, whether you're an atheist or a Zoroastrian, sure, it matters, but honestly, what really matters is whether that person is a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Jew. And if you're going to be good at your job, you are principally going to ask the question, how are you able to be of service to their identity the way that they see it? And that's where I think that, in my mind, is like a super inspiring story that takes place on a regular basis in our hospitals.
There have been a bunch of questions coming in. Chris, I don't want to interrupt if you want to piggy on that, but
No, I'm okay. Let's move to questions.
So there's actually two which I'm going to combine. There's a few that touch on the same thing, including a question from Anne-Marie Slaughter about, you have this incredible the energy that you're talking about, Eboo. The degree, Krista, you're talking about, we need to recreate this, right? We don't have the public space for this kind of addressing, whether it's our grief, our death, the lamentation, whether it's the ability for people just to connect at that unbelievably basic, elemental human level, right? Regardless of faith, regardless of background. But the question then is there a bridge that's at all evident into the public sphere? Because we know all this is out there. We confront it, we find it, it's there, and its beauty is there every day. And then you enter this amorphous thing called the public sphere, whether it's via news or just via your own political views, and it's gone, right? It's almost as if it's evaporated in the face of that anger, in the face of that outrage. Is there any bridge that we can think of, or is it just, we're in this incredibly messy, chaotic moment, and the best we can do is try to be that at a local level and hope that somehow that coalesces to something different?
I'm not sure this is getting at it, but what comes to mind, I mean, we are in an in-between moment. We're in an in-between moment with every discipline. The forms that came out of the 20th century do not work in the 21st. And that was going to be true even if our politics weren't in disarray, although our politics in disarray is another symptom of that. Even if our politics weren't in disarray, we were going to have to reinvent everything, including common life. And religious forms, just like other forms, don't make sense anymore. There is an evolution underway, and we're in this period where we can see what's broken so clearly on every front. But the reinvention is happening, right? But again, it's happening in places. It's happening on the ground. It's not happening at a level or in a way that official way of seeing and reporting that we have, and even deliberating, it doesn't see that. What comes to mind for me, is that I was on one of these Zoom calls in these months with a bunch of rabbis. And one of them said, we have these rituals of lamentation, which originally were supposed to be not just, within the synagogue, but offered up as a public experience. And I just said, do that, like recover that piece of it that offers this, what I want to call spiritual intelligence, which meets everything we're learning about biology and neuroscience. And offer that up to shared life. The other thing that occurs to me is I live in Minneapolis. After George Floyd was murdered here, after we had some nights of violence, as I went over to those parts of my city, really just one part of the city. If you watched CNN, you would have thought the entire city was on fire, and it wasn't. What I saw, and actually in St. Paul and in Minneapolis, when I was asking people, like, where do I go? Where do I go to help? Where do I go to understand what's happening? Where they pointed me in both cities were churches. Churches that had been opened wide and the pews filled up with groceries and diapers and mental health services and advice on housing and getting the help you needed. And this was, also right in the middle of the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic. I had this moment of, we have like churches and religious institutions have physical plants in the middle of cities, and nobody comes downtown to services anymore the way they, this is part of the disintegration of the form. But what I was seeing in front of me were these institutions recovering their heart, right? This is what it was supposed to be about. These places of refuge and care, and practically speaking. So I guess part of what I'm saying is I don't think we're necessarily going to see it as public action, but I think part of the discipline to getting to the recreation and telling the fuller story is looking in unexpected places.
Krista, I'm curious. So if you were to turn on, if you were from England or Australia or New Zealand or Greenland, and you showed up in America, would you think that religion was absent from public culture? You're flipping the TV on Sunday morning, and there's Joel Osteen, right? And there's there's Catholic Mass, in Chicago, Channel 7, right? I'm curious what our reference point is when we say religion is absent from public culture.
Yeah, I guess, I guess what I'm saying is that I think, of course, people attending worship services is one way to talk about the health of religion. What I'm asking, civilizationally, if religious and spiritual traditions are part of the human enterprise, I think that perhaps the decline of the forms as we've known them creates a space where the really deep and muscular offerings of this part of the human enterprise find their place, in the middle of life.
Hmm. So, two more related ideas. One a question from someone is, what would a healed or a more healing America look like? And I'll add the twist to that of what is reasonable or feasible versus what is dreamable, right? So as opposed to, as opposed to I have a dream, what dream in the next 5 years, let alone 5 months, do we think is realistic given where culture is from a more, recognizing each other's humanity and what manifestation that would have in the public sphere? In 30 seconds or less.
I guess I would just throw out there in 30 seconds or less that healing is not the same as curing and fixing. And in fact, curing and fixing are often fictional and actually stopgap measures. But you can be flawed, you can be imperfect, you can be searching, you can be struggling, and you can be whole. And I think what we have to do is figure out how to be whole. And again, I keep pointing at the 21st century shows us that means something so different. To me, wholeness is the destination of our reckonings with race, with diversity, right? It's not just that we want to be diverse, we want to be whole. We want that to be meaningful. To me, what can happen in the next 5 years, and it could happen sooner than that, again, is we stop having this expectation, which I know Eboo says, we have to assume and understand the reality and accept the reality that there are deep and meaningful differences between us. And they are in the room with us. But what divides us now, what makes us different from each other, does not have to define what can become possible between us. So accept those differences and create a new foundation for what the possible is. And it's not going to be unity. I understand that politicians have to use a word like unity. It's a beautiful aspiration, and that's not what healing is going to look like.
Eboo?
Yeah, I'm going to actually tell a quick story, which is the one I intended to start with, which I think in a side doorway addresses this question. So here's how I got interested in religion. One of the ways I got interested. So I was an angry activist when I was in college and for some years afterwards, and I basically got involved in any anti-colonial cause that I could. And so for a while it was free Tibet. And I wasn't involved because I was deeply admiring of the Dalai Lama. That wasn't my first interest. It was because it struck me as an anti-colonial cause. And as I'm kind of reading in a lot of the people who are involved in it, you wind up reading a lot of Buddhist monks and a lot of Buddhist thinkers. And I'll never forget, I'm 21 or 22 years old, and I read a Tibetan Buddhist monk saying that his personal greatest fear was that his long years in captivity and being tortured was going to cause him to lose his love for his captors, which would be a violation of his vows as a Buddhist monk. And I remember just being floored because it occurred to me that there were two things going on. And this is maybe in the mind of a 22-year-old male. One, it was just such a display of strength in a way that I'd never thought about strength. And the second was that it was not a part of any earthly or material logic I had ever heard of. That this individual was following an entirely different logic. It was not a logic of reciprocal human behavior. It was not you did this to me and I'm going to do this to you. It wasn't even like part of it, in a way, an Abrahamic or Western religion logic of something around an eye for an eye, right? Whether it's you do an eye for an eye or you don't do an eye for an eye, it still revolves around that logic. This was a totally different logic. It was because of the forces of the universe, I am meant to be kind, and there is nothing that you can. I want nothing that you do to me to create any different behavior, because I am anchored in something cosmic. And it was just so shockingly inspiring to me. And I thought to myself, like, where is that logic that is beyond the material? I think that is a huge part of what religion contributes, right? Peter Berger, somebody said, we speak of the eternal in a world that is absolutely dominated by the present. And I think in some ways, I think that, although I'm arguing a little bit with my friend Krista here, I think that is something that my wild guess is we kind of deeply agree on, is there is a different logic in religious and spiritual traditions, and its proximity to us as human beings who think we control the universe is much further than it was for people in prior generations who knew that they did not control the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a what can we expect and what is feasible, one thing I tend to fall back on or try to infuse is, particularly for American culture, but frankly for most cultures, that history of roiling conflict and struggle and challenge and that feeling of being deeply at dis-ease at a time of disease with who we are is much more of a constant of our path and our past than a brief moment in the late 1940s and 1950s where we had more of an illusion that we were all together. And the fact that we kind of came together over time, including with a good degree of religious coexistence and acceptance, is much more comforting from the vantage point of the present than it was to live through it at the time. Yeah. There's a lot of talk this year about, is this like 1968 with racial violence and kind of a comeuppance with our divisions? And I feel like in an unprovable way, the only substantial difference between now and 1968 is that the people who look back at 1968 and go, it wasn't as bad, know that it turned out without our worst fears being realized, and we will never know in our present whether or not our worst fears are going to be realized in the future. And that changes a lot. I want to end with a great question, given the envelope of a Progress Network, which is, what keeps each of us optimistic, right? What keeps each of us looking toward that future as potentially a movement forward, a learning of, a creating something more whole. For me, partly it is that awareness of the fact that things went okay in the past is no guarantee they're going to go okay in the future. And financial people tell you that all the time about past results are no guarantee of future performance. But as an awareness of, we have been here before, that this can feel totally of the moment. It can feel unique. It can feel like human beings haven't confronted this, but we have, and we have muddled through in a way that is ultimately somewhat better on the other side of it. And look, I take a lot of succor from that reality and the belief that the human capacity to create is ultimately stronger, even if marginally so. But I guess, Eboo, give us what keeps you, what's the opposite of keeping you up at night? What allows you to not be kept up at night? And then Krista can have the final word on that.
I mean, Joe Biden won, and he didn't say time to vanquish our opponents. He said, I'm going to be a president of healing and unity, etc. I think that that's remarkable. At some point, the Secret Service will escort Donald Trump out of the White House. And I keep on telling people how hopeful this makes me. And people are like, do you think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have a magic wand? I'm like, no, you don't get it, right? It's not about magic wands. It's about, I feel like, I keep on using this medical examples. I'm the furthest thing from a medical doctor. I just think that they're great metaphors. I think of the way I feel, the reason I feel hopeful is because I feel like I'm a doctor that's been called in to, gotten a call, somebody's had a car accident, come into the hospital, and you think the worst, and you walk in, and actually it's a set of broken limbs, and you think to yourself, you know what? I can work with this, right? And that's my principal question about everything. Maybe it's the deep pragmatist streak within me is, can I work with this? Okay, I can work. I can contribute. And honestly, the last 4 years has felt like, to use another metaphor, flying a plane in a tornado. And it was just the grotesque bigotry, plus the gross incompetence, plus the gratuitous nastiness out of the Trump administration, met with an understandable and righteous resistance. But it's hard to fly a plane in that. It's hard to kind of articulate like a set of goals and here's where we're going to head to. And I feel like at least the storms ahead are navigable.
Krista?
Well, it kind of feels like Eboo opened something that we could talk about for another hour, because I think that the last 4 years were a symptom and of things that have been building, of ways we've been living all across the spectrum of our life together in our political spectrum. We're seeing the reality of ourselves. We're seeing ourselves in a mirror. But what I, hope to me is, I don't actually use the word optimism, because I think optimism has the ring, and you can use the word optimism, but I think to me it has the ring of wishful thinking. Hope to me is a choice. It's a muscle. And I feel it is absolutely reasonable to exercise if you can become less fixated on the official narrative of dysfunction, and see the full story of our time, which is also full of beauty and courage and invention. This healing, there is a landscape of healing, and Eboo and I, are on this with many other comrades. The Progress Network is stepping onto this, right? This is happening. It's not getting the attention it deserves. It's not taken as seriously as the narrative of dysfunction, even by the people who are on the landscape doing the work. So that's some of the work ahead. The other thing that gives me hope is that at the same time that we are so emotionally, spiritually immature, so far from living into our name, Homo sapiens, the creatures who are wise, we are actually on our scientific frontiers learning about our brains. We are learning how to calm fear. We are learning to be less binary, which is one of the terrible things about our political system. We are learning to befriend complexity. If we can keep the rule of law and not destroy the planet, I really do believe that we are actually gathering the tools in this young century to flourish and not merely survive.
Well, that is the perfect way to bring this temporarily to a close. I love the fact that this is really the beginning of a conversation and not the end of one. And I really want to thank Krista and Eboo and Emma, who's been incredible in bringing all this together, for the opportunity. And for all of you who are part of this, this will be recorded. It will be available. You can email hello@theprogressnetwork.org if you want the link. You can go onto our website once it's working again and sign up for our newsletter. All of those platitudes and homilies about the Progress Network and us trying to build it, but it's really done from the spirit of trying to encourage these connections and these conversations and bringing, Eboo and Krista together, bringing all of you together, because we are indeed only going to make these kinds of changes if we recognize that we're not as atomized as we think, and there are a lot of voices pointing in a much more constructive direction. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And I think, Emma, we are at an end.
We are at an end, so we're going to end the broadcast now, but thanks so much to everyone who joined us. Goodbye, stay safe.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Nice to see you. Thanks, Krista. Thanks.